Good evening, everyone. My name is James Jansen. I'm the new Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs here at Shoreline. And it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Eric Schinfeld, who is President of the Washington State Council on International Trade. But first, as you listen, if you have a question, write it on the question card in your program. And I hope all of you got a program. When you get to the question and answer part of tonight's event, you can ask the question yourself or pass it on to someone else to answer for you. There is also a feedback sheet in your program. Before you leave, please take a moment to tell us what you think or what you liked or disliked about the program and other topics you would like to see discussed in the future. But last but not least, please turn off or silence your cell phones. According to a recent article in the Weekly Standard, quote, "Free trade might not be the first casualty of an American election campaign, but it is right up there." The author goes on to give examples from the current presidential campaign. Obama bashes Romney for sending jobs to China. Romney calls China a currency manipulator and accuses Obama of looking the other way. How do presidential electoral politics affect U.S. trade policy? How do the realities of trade square with the campaign rhetoric? We hope to have a more meaningful discussion of those questions tonight than we have had so far from the candidates in the presidential election. Here to help us is Eric Schinfeld, President of the Washington Council on International Trade, or WCIT, also pronounced WCIT. Some of the audience might recognize Eric from past events. He was here about a year ago to discuss the impact of 9/11, which occurred, of course, in 2001, and the subsequent war on terror on trade policy. WCIT, his organization, represents Washington state farmers, manufacturers, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and individuals who support strong trade policy. In Washington state, 40% of all jobs are tied to trade, so it is easy to understand why WCIT and its members advocate for public policies that expand opportunities for U.S. businesses in the global marketplace. Eric also serves as the Federal Policy Director for the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. Eric was a staff member with the Prosperity Partnership, a coalition of business, government, and community organizations focused on ensuring long-term prosperity for the Puget Sound region. He began his career in that other Washington, our national capital, as a congressional aide to U.S. Congressman Rick Boucher. Eric has a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Affairs. Eric will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will have questions from the audience. Please give a warm Shoreline Community College welcome to Eric Schinfeld.
All right, well, thank you all very much for being here on a weekday night. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and hopefully none of you are baseball fans that are missing your favorite baseball game to come and enjoy this presentation instead. But my hope is to actually make this really interesting, really relevant to you. I'll give some thoughts and opinions on how U.S. trade policy and presidential election politics mix, but I think we can also have a really great interactive discussion as well. Let me talk really briefly about who I am and why I'm here and why I'm at all qualified to talk on this topic whatsoever. I'm the president of the Washington Council on International Trade. We are a trade policy advocacy organization on behalf of Washington state companies. So my members are businesses large and small from across the state of Washington who all understand that trade is an essential part of Washington's economy and want to make sure that trade policy is as beneficial as possible to their ability to be successful in the global marketplace. So I spent a lot of my time in D.C. Working with our members of the U.S. Congress, our 2 senators and our 9, soon to be 10 members of the House, to try and really help them understand what are the policy issues that our businesses face, what are the barriers and opportunities that they face when they're doing business internationally, and how can we make it even better for them to be more successful and create jobs here at home because of what they do. We do 3 things at the Washington Council on International Trade. Like I said, we spend a lot of time with our elected officials, educating them about what the issues are. But really, even more than that, I spend a lot of time with the business community. Most of the business community spends their time running their business and working in their businesses. They don't think about what are the macro, national, and international trade policies that they need to be advocating on in order to be successful. That's my job, but part of my job is to help them understand and help them engage and energize and be active where it's appropriate and where they can be helpful to really make sure trade policy reflects their needs and interests. And we also serve as a repository for quite a lot of data on trade and trade policy, and specifically how it impacts Washington State. And that's where I'm actually going to spend a lot of my talk today, talking about how trade policy impacts Washington State, because I think that's really what's going to make it relevant to you. And then we'll talk again about the national level here. Let's start with, of course, what is trade? We should all have some understanding of that, obviously. And of course, I think when we think of trade, at least when I think of trade, I mostly think of things that go in boxes that goes on ships, right? Whether you're talking about computers or boxes of clothes or food, you think about these big container ships that are pulling into the port of Seattle, the port of Tacoma, that's trade, right? Well, that's a big part of trade, and in fact, here in Washington State, we export about $64 billion a year in goods, things that mostly go either on ships or in planes. But we also, and this is really, really important, we also export about $23 billion in services. Software, tourism, foreign students that come and study at our universities, professional services like legal, architecture, engineering, financial services. These are things that people deliver, companies here deliver either via the internet or in person overseas, Washington companies providing services, and that is right about a third of all of the exports that we have from Washington State. So it's really important when we talk about trade, when we think about trade, it's not just selling goods, it's also selling services. And of course, as we'll talk about in a minute, it's also imports. And imports are a big business for Washington State. We'll talk about that in a second. I did want to mention really briefly, I mentioned foreign students studying here. We know that about $450 million a year come to Washington State because of the foreign students that come and study at our universities and colleges. And it's a big business here in Washington State. It's a really important part of our state's trade economy. As was mentioned earlier, 40% of all jobs in Washington State are tied to trade. This is the result of a recent study that actually came out on October 2nd, less than a month ago, that we put out and really looked at how is trade impacting Washington State, and how can we do an even better job? I mean, 40% is an amazing number if you think about it. Almost half, if you want to think about it that way. 40% of all jobs in Washington State are in some way tied to trade, which means that trade is the single largest driver of our state's economy. Bigger than aerospace, bigger than information technology, bigger than agriculture. 40% of all jobs in Washington State tied to trade. This is a huge number. And the thing that really gets me about this number more than anything else is that it has mostly happened by accident, right? If you think about it, what kind of comprehensive, purposeful state strategy have we had to grow trade in Washington State? There really hasn't been one. It's really the result of the fact that Bill Boeing was born here and Bill Gates was born here, and they built their companies here, and we know now that about 90% of Boeing airplanes are sold to international customers right now. About 60% of Microsoft software is sold to international customers. Of our agricultural products, depending on the product, between 30 to 90% of our agricultural products are sold overseas. I'll give you some examples of some of those agricultural products that are 90%. 90% of Washington wheat is sold overseas, internationally, including Canada and Mexico. 90% of Washington hay is sold internationally. And my personal favorite, 90% of Washington hops are sold internationally. We happen to be, this is a really interesting side note here, 70% of all the world's hops, which of course, as most of you know, make beer, 70% of the world's hops are grown in the Yakima Valley. So that's a really fascinating statistic. So anyway, the point being here, we've been really lucky. We're lucky to make incredible airplanes that people around the world want to buy. We're lucky to make incredible software that people around the world want to buy. We're lucky to be able to grow these wonderful products, food products, and wine that people want to buy around the world, but mostly lucky. And mostly sort of individual, oh, we're doing an initiative here, or something's happening here, or a company's locating here for one or two or three reasons. The fact that we've never had this comprehensive strategy is really amazing to me. And what excites me about that is if we're at 40% now, what could happen if we actually were trying? What could happen if we actually had a comprehensive strategy to grow trade in Washington State and leverage all of these assets and bring people together and make the kinds of investments and policy decisions that we need to make in order to make the state even more successful and competitive internationally? So that's what's in this strategy. And if you're interested, by the way, you can read this strategy. It's at wcit.org/strategy. Which is a pretty straightforward URL. And you don't have to read all 45 pages. I know a lot of the students in the room, the idea of reading 45 pages is another burden in addition to all of your other schoolwork. So there's a great 2-page summary, which I would highly recommend. It's much faster to read. But this is a really important part of what we do. Let me talk about some of the statistics that are in there. And let me talk about exports first. I've already talked about this. $64 billion in goods exports, $23 billion in services exports, all from Washington State. These are not national figures. We're talking about almost $100 billion in overseas exports, international exports. I always do that. Canada is not overseas, and Mexico is not overseas. 325,000 direct jobs. And some of you know this distinction, direct jobs and indirect jobs. Direct job is, I am somebody who sells goods overseas. The indirect job is the job that is created because I have all this money from having this job and I spend that money, and so all these indirect jobs are created. 325,000 direct jobs. Jobs at Boeing, jobs at Microsoft, jobs at this college that are dealing with these foreign students, like I mentioned. The reason that we care about exports, and the reason that everyone in the U.S. cares about exports, the reason that trade is important, and that President Obama, when he started his term, said we're going to double exports over the next 5 years, is that 96% of all customers in the world are not in the United States. Right? We're a country of 300 million people, which means that most people are not in the United States, which means that if we want to sell our products to as many people as possible, we have to be selling them to people not in this country. And frankly, the way our economy has been over the last few years, there have been even less people in this country that have the ability to be able to buy those products and services. And so we need to be even more thoughtful about increasing trade. And so that's really, at the end of the day, why do we care about trade? Why is trade a big deal for our economy? Because we're trying to make money, and we're trying to make money selling to people, and those people, most of them are not here. A lot of these companies, I mentioned Boeing and Microsoft a lot because they're easy to mention. We all know Boeing and Microsoft. 90% of the companies that are exporting are small businesses. So this is for everybody. This is not, oh, well, I don't work at Microsoft, I don't work at Boeing, I don't care about trade. And part of the reason why we're so successful in trade and so successful in exports is we have these amazing ports. We're a gateway city, Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, Port of Everett. We actually have 75 ports in the state of Washington, if you can believe that. And so we're a gateway to Canada, we're a gateway to Asia because of our ports. Let's talk about imports for a second, and this is where we're going to get into, the real presidential politics and the real controversial politics that we face. Imports, at least for Washington State, create jobs. This is a big statement here, right? Because when we think about imports, and when we're going to talk about how this impacts the presidential election, the buzzword is outsourcing, right? The buzzword is jobs lost to globalization, and this is true. We have lost jobs to globalization. Globalization has caused a lot of pain and disruption in a lot of people's lives in this country. Industries that have changed, industries that are now mostly done overseas. 99% of all shoes are now made outside of the United States. Just as one statistic here, we don't make shoes here anymore. And there are bad parts of that, But there are also some benefits to imports, particularly for Washington state. We have 145,000 direct jobs that are created in this state because of imports. And there's really two main sources of that. Number one, of course, is our ports. Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma, about 75% of the goods that are coming in and out of the Port of Tacoma are imported goods. Like I said, we're a gateway from Asia. So when goods come from Asia, where do they come from? Well, they're going to come through really three places. They're going to come through California, they're going to come through Washington state, or maybe they're going to come through Canada or the Panama Canal, but we don't want that. We want them to come through the West Coast, right? So we've got all these goods coming to the United States, and of those goods coming to the United States, we're getting about 4 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. That's what a container looks like, one of those big containers on a ship's. About 4 million of those coming through the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, and of those, most of those are going through Washington state to the rest of the country. They're going on trucks, they're going on trains, they're going to Chicago and to the rest of the country. And so all of those jobs that are at our ports, 70% of them, because 70% of the goods are imported goods, 70% of the jobs at the ports are import-related jobs. And then we have all the jobs that are created because of those goods getting imported to the Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma and Port of Everett that are jobs for truckers, jobs for rail folks, jobs in the logistics industry, expediters and freight forwarders and customs brokers that are all created because of imports. So that's one category. And the second category are the jobs that are created at headquartered companies here. There are a number of companies here in Washington state that have a global supply chain. Boeing, Starbucks, Costco, Amazon, REI, all of these companies that we know have suppliers throughout the world. And they have those suppliers and they import those goods into Washington state. And part of the reason that they import those goods is because they found that they can be more competitive as a company by having a global supply chain. And part of the impact of them being more competitive is that they can sell more products and create more jobs. And so when we talk about import-related jobs, we include jobs that exist at some of these headquarter companies, jobs in marketing, jobs in administration, jobs in accounting, jobs in legal services that exist because these companies are successful, in part because they have an import-related global supply chain. And I'll say one other thing about imports here is that a lot of the products that Washington state companies import, talking about parts of Boeing airplanes, talking about clothes that are imported to the distribution centers for Amazon and REI and Costco, those are products that are then exported. And so really when you talk about imports, it's not only a one-way street. A Boeing plane gets a bunch of parts from China or India or Italy or Japan, and then we sell those planes back to China or India or Italy or Japan. And so when we think about imports, it's not only, okay, well, we're losing these jobs because these jobs are going to folks overseas. We're creating jobs by bringing these products in, and then we're creating jobs by then selling the finished products that we're making here. So it's a sensitive issue. It's a sensitive issue in the campaign. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's important to know that when we talk about Washington state and imports, it's not just about job loss, it's also about job creation as well. Here's the thing about federal trade policy. This is my job. I work on federal trade policy. I go to DC, I lobby on federal trade policy issues. I say, pass all these trade policy issues. They're really great. They're going to create jobs in Washington state. And not only are we successful at doing that, but we're successful in doing that in a broadly bipartisan way. I don't know if many of you have been following Congress over the past few years, but these people don't really get along. And even more than not getting along, they really don't like to pass bills. It seems they spend a lot of their time trying very hard not to pass legislation. And yet, in terms of trade policy, we've had huge wins and huge bipartisan wins just over the past year alone. Last October, we passed 3 free trade agreements, Korea, Colombia, and Panama. These were big. Korea alone, Korea is Washington state's 4th largest trading partner. It's going to create 10,000 jobs in Washington state because of this Korea Free Trade Agreement over the next 5 years. And this passed for us with huge bipartisan margins, 278 to 151 in the House, 83 to 15 in the Senate. These are, this is not, this is a controversial issue. These are huge bipartisan margins. We passed a reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank, which I'm sure none of you know about. It's a very, very boring topic. This is what I'm paid to care about here. But essentially, it's a government agency that lends money to companies to import and to export. It helps to create jobs. It's a major service that the government provides. It's a huge deal for Washington State because Boeing happens to be the #1 user of this Export-Import Bank. It passed the House with 330 votes out of 435. Passed the Senate 78-20. So my point in showing this to you is trade in Congress right now is not a Republican versus Democrat issue. It's a bipartisan issue, and frankly, it's one of the only issues where Congress has found the ability to agree and get some things done. So let's move to the US presidential election. And what's interesting about the slide I just showed you, with all this great agreement about trade, and everyone loves trade in Congress, the general public does not agree. This is not a sentiment that is broadly shared by your average person not inside the Beltway. These are a bunch of stats. The next couple of slides I'm going to show are from Pew Research. Many of you know the Pew organization has a lot of different branches that they work on, attitudes and surveying of public opinion, and do a lot of great research. And this is some of the most recent research that they have done on trade and trade policy issues. So the general public, about 55% of them think that it's important to have a strong relationship with China. But 56% of them also think it's really important to be really tough on China, right? And in my introduction, we talked about, who's tougher on China, President Obama or Governor Romney? They're trying to out-tough each other on China here. So 56% of people think that it's important to be tough on China. Only 49% of quote-unquote experts, we can talk about who those experts are and why they matter or maybe don't matter. So less experts feel that way, not by a big margin, but as you'll see there, the huge margin is that 84% of experts think that it's really important to have a strong economic relationship with China compared to that 55% of the general public. So we're seeing this disconnect here. Let me just stop for 1 second. Why am I talking about China? We're talking about US trade policy, right? There's tons of US trade policy. We have trade with the European Union. We have trade with South America. We have trade, of course, with Canada and Mexico. Some of you may have heard of NAFTA. This used to be a big controversial issue in US presidential politics. I challenge you to find lengthy discussions of any of those other topics in the US presidential campaign this year. That's not what people are talking about. So I'm not going to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about why it is or is not important. The only US trade policy that's being talked about right now in the presidential campaign is China. Is China good? Is China bad? Is China our friend? Is China our adversary? Should we do more trade with China? Should we be tougher on China? This is what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about China for the rest of this presentation here. My point here with this slide, there's a disconnect between what experts, economists think we need to be able to do, what our trade policy with China should be, and what the general public thinks. This other slide here may be a little bit harder to see here, but essentially people have a lot of concern about our debt with China, our loss of US jobs with China, our trade deficits. I'll point you to that middle column there. It says loss of US jobs to China, and this is the percent of people in the general public who think that this is a very, very serious problem. 71% of the general public thinks that loss of jobs to China is a huge, huge, serious problem. And then you go down the list, and we're talking about in the teens and 20s for these experts that were interviewed here. 15% of business and trade experts think that our loss of US jobs to China is a problem. The news media, 22% of the news media thinks that loss of US jobs to China is a serious problem for the US. Now, who's right? I don't know. But the important point is here, there is a huge disconnect. The people that I talk to, the people I deal with on an everyday basis, me going and talking to Congress, clearly the folks down there, the experts, quote unquote, they all agree with me. It makes my job very easy, right? I'm hugely successful in my job because everyone agrees with me. But the general public does not feel that way. And this is, when we're, let's get to the point of this conversation here. We're talking about how will people vote? Who do they want to be their presidents? And to the extent that trade matters to how people vote for president, and we'll talk about that in 1 second, they are much more concerned, the average US voter is much more concerned about China and being tough on China than the average expert. So let's talk about the partisan split. Let's talk about who's voting for whom here. You will see that this chart on the left here is who feels like President Obama is being too tough on China. Well, there's great bipartisan agreement. We all agree, apparently, only 2% of people, Democrat or Republican or independent, think that we're being too tough on China. So there's some agreement there. However, not tough enough, the next line down, 65% of Republicans think that Obama is not being tough enough on China, where only 35% of Democrats think that Obama is not being too tough on China, and independents are split 50-50. So certainly independents and Republicans much more concerned with being tough on China than Democrats. Democrats, if you go down one column, about 51% think that Obama is just right. Just like Goldilocks, it's it's just right, and a lot of people don't know as well. So people, when they think about being tough on China, when they think about China, and as we've talked about here, we're equating tonight China policy with U.S. trade policy writ large, even though that's not necessarily all that there is with trade policy. So 49% to 40 voters say that Governor Romney would do a better job dealing with China's trade policies. So, this is what we're talking about here. So almost half of people are talking about if they care about trade, which means they care about China, they think that Governor Romney would do a better job by almost 10%. Let's go back for 1 second before I get to my grand finale here on what's really going to happen in this election. Let's go back to Washington State, which is my favorite topic because I run an organization called the Washington Council on International Trade, and my job is to think about Washington State. China is our biggest trading partner for Washington State by a large margin. They are the biggest source of imports that come into Washington State. They are the biggest market for our exports, goods and services. It is our largest source of foreign students who come here. It is our largest source of foreign direct investment that comes here, and it is the fastest growing source of foreign tourists who come here. And so whatever you think is the proper quote-unquote China trade policy, regardless of whether you think we need to be tougher on China or less tough on China, we in Washington State are inextricably linked to China. Our success as an economy, our success as a state depends on our ability to have a successful trade relationship with China. Good thing, bad thing, whatever you want to think about that, that is the truth. And so we need to be very, very careful here in Washington State when we say, let's be tougher on China, because if we're tougher on China in the wrong way, and this is a two-way street, right? They can feel free to be tougher on us right back. And decide that maybe they don't want to buy Washington State goods. Maybe they want to have higher tariffs or bigger market barriers on Washington State goods or U.S. goods. If we start to get into that tit for tat, who can be tougher on each other, we're the ones who are going to suffer for that. So I think that's a very, very important sort of factual basis for when we talk about what our U.S. trade policy with China should be. We need to worry, yes, are there things that we would like China to do differently? Absolutely. How do we get there? That's a different question. What is our process? How do we productively engage with China on things like better protection of our intellectual property, on increasing market access for our companies, on creating level playing field for our businesses to do business in China? That's a very important discussion. Is it by being tough? Is it by engaging in bilateral negotiations? Are there other ways to do this? That I think is really the question. That's really at the core of this distinction and this disagreement in terms of what our U.S.-China policy should be. So I saw this quote the other day. This is my new favorite quote. I'm voting for whoever is toughest on China. Nobody. 0 Americans in 2012 are going to determine their vote simply by who is toughest on China. That's not realistic. Mostly, this is the list of voters' priorities in 2012. It's actually remarkably similar from 2008, which is surprising in some ways. You would think that things have changed, but they really haven't. 87% of people, when they talk about what's most important to them in terms of how they're going to vote, say the economy, followed by jobs, which I'm not sure how that's different, but it seems to be different in some way. Healthcare, education, budget deficit, taxes, all the way down. Foreign policy is way down that list at 60%. So I am not here to tell you that, as much as I may think that trade is the best and the most important thing, particularly for Washington State, I don't really see it being the biggest driver for how people are going to vote. So whoever is toughest on China, whoever people are convinced is toughest on China, which according to surveys seems to be Governor Romney, 49% to 40%, that's going to sway their vote in that way. But it seems like there are many other issues, investments in infrastructure, education, other policy issues, healthcare obviously being a major one that we're hearing a lot about in the campaign, that are going to determine how people vote in this election. Should people be more concerned about trade policy? Should people prioritize, trade policy? However people, whichever candidates, agrees with my trade policy, that's how I'm going to vote. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. I don't think they're going to be. But that, of course, is up to all of you to decide how you're going to vote. My goal was just to give you some background and insights, and hopefully you received that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Okay, because we are recording this event, if you have a question, you want to ask a question yourself, just raise your hand and somebody will run around with the microphone and you get to ask your question into the microphone. And Eric is going to stay up there at the podium and give answers to your questions. Okay, so who wants to ask their first question so I can get rid of this microphone?
Behind you.
Dave.
Excuse me.
It's a hostile question.
Do the Chinese particularly care which candidate gets elected?
That's a very interesting question. Let me say two first things about that. First of all, another survey that Pew Research did recently was Chinese attitudes towards America. Chinese attitudes towards America are incredibly friendly. They really look to America as a partner, as a friend, as a great trading partner, and as a country that is inextricably linked to them in terms of the economy. Like I was saying earlier, that we're linked to them. Over the past 2 years, Chinese positive feelings about our country have decreased significantly. And there's one reason why they've decreased significantly, because they're paying very close attention to this election and the rhetoric that they're hearing. They're hearing us bash them. And to some extent, they understand that this is election year politics, and that's what people say. But it's having an impact. It really is. They are less friendly. They have less good feelings towards the United States. That's number one. Number two is this is an election year for the United States, as we all know, for who's going to be the president. It also happens to be an election year for China. And in fact, within the same week as we have our election, they will be having their election to elect their new leadership in China. And there has been, you may or may not be surprised, some political advantage to the Chinese government as it looks to a transition to bash the United States. We both find it very mutually beneficial to bash each other as a way to get elected to things, which, maybe that's a good way to get elected. I don't know. But so we're in a very interesting time right now in terms of our mutual feelings to each other, both being influenced by our mutual presidential elections. Do they care who gets elected? I think that, like I said, at the end of the day, most people, most sophisticated people in China understand that a lot of this election year rhetoric is exactly that. It's election year rhetoric, right? And both President Obama and Governor Romney have shown themselves to actually be, presidential politics aside, pretty smart about trade policy and pretty smart about China policy in particular. Governor Romney obviously has a lot of experience doing business in China. That's part of what he's been doing. And President Obama, besides more recently, a lot of the politically motivated, potentially cases that he's brought to the WTO on China, has really, I think, engaged very productively with China. So I think probably they understand that whoever gets elected probably understands there's an opportunity to have a good relationship there, but it's definitely hurt.
it seems to me that the more important, the reason why the balance, the trade balance, because why the trade balance can be so large as right now, it's just simply because in most Asian countries, of course, including China, the wages are, way in Asia way low. Now like Mitt Romney and President Obama are talking about like a currency manipulation or maybe some trade practices, but the basic, the more important reason is that the wages differences. Well, it will take a long time probably for that to equalize, like for Asian countries to improve their living standard and then their wages will increase. Like even in China, the wages are increasing, and along with the living standard are going up, and their purchasing power are going up, and so now looks like the candidates just cannot get into this the real difference, because there's no real solution, seems to me. Probably the only time will be able to take time to solve the real issue. That's what my thoughts, and the trade, even they're talking about the trade, the currency manipulation, but even if China, in the past 2 years, each year, they cannot probably allow much more than 5% or 5-6% in currency like appreciation, because otherwise they will lose their job. They have 20 million people, around 15 or 20 million people every year, even just for the increase of the population.
I'm glad you brought up the trade deficit. There's a couple of interesting points about the trade deficit. I think we all know that we have a trade deficit with China. That's entirely true. But some of you may not know, I spent a lot of time talking about services exports from Washington State. We actually have a several $100 billion trade surplus in the United States in terms of services exports. If you just compare services exports to services imports, we actually have a huge trade surplus. And so really when we talk about our trade deficit, it's mostly driven by goods. And frankly, one of the biggest parts of our trade deficit is not trade with China, it's oil imports. And so as we look at ways for this country to get more energy independent, that's actually going to be the biggest factor driving our trade deficit or trade imbalance. The other important thing that we think about when we think about the trade deficits is that we right now calculate our trade deficit in terms of the full cost of goods, right? Rather than what some of us refer to as the value added cost of those goods. So when you look at something like the iPhone, right? Foxconn is making the iPhone for Apple in China. And so when Apple brings all of those finished iPhones over to the United States, for every $150 iPhone that's coming to the United States, we add $150 to our trade deficit. The value add of the work done in China on the iPhone is $2. A majority of the value add of the iPhone is the engineering. It's the high-tech pieces of the iPhone. In China, they're slapping these things together. That's all they're doing. They're not doing high-skill, high intellectual property work. And so if we actually value our trade deficit based on only the value-added difference, the trade deficit, again, is a lot smaller. We still have a trade deficit, but I think that's significant because we always have to be thinking about what is the actual problem, what's the actual data telling us. I do think that obviously wages are a huge driver of business, although it's really funny when you look at China right now, how many companies are starting to complain about the high wage costs in China. And how many Chinese people are complaining about, wow, all the good jobs are getting shipped out of country to Cambodia and Vietnam. This is a trend that happens. Countries develop in this way, and as there's a rising middle class, it becomes more expensive, and the Chinese economy shifts from these very low skill services to higher value and higher skill industries. So this is something that is a transition. This is part of the process of globalization. We probably can't stop this, and even if we could stop it, if we could put huge tariff barriers up on our walls and make sure that all of the goods coming in from China are valued at what we think their currency should be valued at, right? If we think that their currency is here and it should be valued here, and we put a tariff on to make up the difference, it's not going to automatically make our country more competitive. In fact, it's going to have a lot of negative consequences. And so, again, we have to be really thoughtful about what trade policy is telling us and what the right steps are. We can't change this overnight, but we really do have the opportunity increasingly to make sure that our country is as successful as possible in the global economy, and that's what's going to create jobs.
Hi. I have a question about about currency manipulation. Is the currency manipulation, you just mentioned the iPhone, how the labor input is about $2 per phone. If they are manipulating their currency, would them changing it to a more fair price of currency actually really hurt their comparative advantage in manufacturing? Or is it just a campaign talking point for the most part? And the second part of the question, I guess, is Romney's constantly mentioning how he's going to label China a currency manipulator on day one. If he was to pursue that path, how would that affect our relationship with China?
Currency manipulation is a really interesting phrase. It really makes it seem like this very, very evil, manipulative thing that people are doing. Every country in the world manipulates its currency. That's what we do, right? The Federal Reserve Bank, the purpose of the Federal Reserve Bank in some significant part is to make sure that our currency valuation is competitive. And we balance, and that's really what our U.S. fiscal policy and monetary policy is about figuring out how we in part value our currency so that it is not so high that our exports are unaffordable to the rest of the world, and not so low that we can't afford to buy anything, right? That our currency is useless. So we all do this, right? We all value our currency and set our fiscal and monetary policies in ways that we try and impact how our currency is valued in the international marketplace. And different currencies fluctuate based on different things. Some are pegged, some are variable, some are pegged to us. And so what is the proper valuation of the Chinese currency is a really, really complicated subject. I don't think anyone really can say with exact accuracy, oh, Chinese currency, should be this. And furthermore, we've seen a pretty amazing rise in Chinese currency valuation over the past 5 years. This is something that they are actively pursuing, not just because we're making them feel bad about it, but because they know that there are some advantages to them. A currency held too low, like I said, is not a good policy for the people of a country. Yes, it allows for cheap exports, but it doesn't allow for that country's currency to have enough buying power, particularly with a rising middle class. And so this is an issue that China is already addressing. This is an issue that we have to be very careful about what we say their currency should be, because other people have a lot of thoughts on what our currency should be. Brazil actually just announced today that they would like to reopen in the WTO the guidelines for how all countries should be evaluating their currency and what is okay and what is not okay in terms of currency manipulation for all countries. So this is the very sensitive topic. Could China's currency valuation rise? Yes. Is it rising? Absolutely. Will it continue to rise? 100%. So Maybe not as fast as we would like it to, but as the previous questioner said, we also have to be sensitive to their job is to protect their economy and make their economy successful within the bounds of the World Trade Organization and international rules and international trade policies. So Romney gets elected, let's say, and day one, the first thing he does after putting all the R's back in the keyboards, for those of you who know how presidential elections transition, if you don't, when there's a Democratic president, and then it transitions to a Republican president. The staff takes all the R's out of all the computers and hides them, and the same they take the D's out the other way around. This is your government dollars at work. But anyway, so day one, Romney comes into office and he puts the R's back, and you need those R's if you're going to spell currency manipulation on the computer. He puts all the R's back in the keyboards, and let's say yes, day one. He brands China as a currency manipulator. That does not have an impact, per se. It gives him the power to then go and say to China, we'd really like you to revalue your currency. And he can say it maybe in a stronger way than we're doing right now. And again, what would China do in relationship to that? I'm not sure that they would do much. It wouldn't make them feel very happy. It might make them inclined to do some things to our products and services coming into their country. So it would be interesting. And I think that he would probably do that. But I think that, again, this is a very, very experienced business person who understands international trade very well. I think that he would potentially do some things symbolically, but I think he also knows enough to make sure that we're not doing things that are going to be not in our long-term best interests. Yeah.
International trade with China and other Asian countries, how much of a limiting factor is our rail system? And how much difference will the widening of the Panama Canal make?
Fantastic question. Thank you very much for that. Let's talk about the Panama Canal first. Some of you may know that the Panama Canal is getting widened. The Panama Canal will be wider by 2014 or so than it is right now. Well, why does this matter? Ships are getting a lot bigger. Right now, the largest ship in the world, I mentioned these TEUs, the largest ship in the world can carry 13,000 TEUs. In a few years, the largest ship in the world will be able to hold 18,000 TEUs. That's a lot of boxes. And in order to carry all those boxes, you have to be a pretty big ship, right? In fact, you have to be a ship so big that you can't fit through the current Panama Canal, which is a problem if you're trying to go from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. So they're widening it, which is absolutely the right thing for them to do. It's a huge, huge project. It's very exciting. The concern for folks on the West Coast right now is that we get all of these ships full of goods coming to the West Coast. All the goods get offloaded onto trucks and trains, and then they go to the rest of the country. If the Panama Canal is big enough, maybe those ships, instead of going to the West Coast, will go through the Panama Canal to the East Coast instead. They'll do the all-water route to the East Coast, and they'll bypass our ports. And we would not like that because, as I may have mentioned earlier, we have a lot of jobs because we're a port gateway, and we've got all of these port jobs offloading all this cargo. That would not be a good thing. Sorry, Larry? It'd be the same impact on exports as well. And not only because of that, but because when those containers come to the port of Seattle and we offload them and we empty them, those are the containers that we use to export. So if we don't have the import containers coming here, we won't have boxes to put our stuff in to export them. So that's a problem. But anyway, so how worried are we about this? How worried are we that there won't be any ships coming to Washington State anymore, that all of them are going to go through the Panama Canal? Not actually that much. That may be a surprising answer to you. If I were LA Long Beach, I'd be a lot more worried. But even them, I wouldn't worry too much. And here's the reason why. The reason that ships come to the West Coast, in part, is because there are people on the West Coast, and some of those people are buying some of those goods, right? And so you have to come to the West Coast in part. You have to do that. You have to offload. I mentioned that about 70% of the goods that come to the Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma go on to the rest of the country. Well, that means that 30% of them stay here, and that's not an insignificant number. In LA Long Beach, the ships that go to LA, 60% of the cargo stays. Because it's just such a huge market down there in LA. So those ships, to some extent, have to go there. And they have to go there not only to get to LA and Washington State, but also to all of the places between here and Chicago and to Chicago. There are a number of places that are going to be closer if you go an all-water route to the East Coast, right? New York and the South and Florida and everywhere else. So some ships will want to go there. But how do ships make their decision about where they go? Well, they make their decisions based on speed, but also cost. What's going to be the cost of fuel to go that longer route over water? What's going to be the cost to go through the Panama Canal? They haven't set rates yet. And you got this big 18,000 TEU ship going through this newly expanded Panama Canal. They're paying for that Panama Canal expansion with increased rates. That's how they pay for this expansion. So we're not super worried about that. We're much more worried in Washington State about the hugely expanded port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia, which is attracting a lot of cargo much closer to us, and they don't have as much taxes on that cargo, so it's cheaper to go through Port of Prince Rupert. But we can talk about that a little bit later. Your other question was about rail. And I think it was specifically, do we have a good enough rail system here in Washington State? And rail is a tremendous driver of our trade economy because, like I said, and I'll say it a million times more, most of the goods coming here are going elsewhere. They're getting on a train and they're going to Chicago. And from Chicago, then that's getting distributed to the rest of the country and to the Midwest specifically. So we need really good train service to get our goods from the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma and the Port of Longview and the Port of Vancouver, Washington, Port of Everett to the rest of the country. And we have pretty good train service right now. We have two major rail companies serving our state, Union Pacific and BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe. They've invested heavily in creating really great rail networks. There's 3 major rail corridors running through our state. The biggest problem with rail in our state, and I think many of you who live nearby probably know that, is grade separation. We have a lot of train crossings in our communities, and that's a problem both for the communities, if you're trying to, for example, get somewhere and you're stuck behind a train, or if you're a train and you have to slow down going through all these communities. It impacts our ability to get our goods to market as fast as possible. So we have a lot of investment that we need to make as Washington State to make sure that our rail system is not only as good as it is right now, but is usable and as efficient as possible and workable for our communities. I thought the question you were going to ask me was going to be about coal train exports, which is a question we could talk about if you want to. But really, at the end of the day, the biggest driver of the opposition to coal train exports, yes, coal is bad and burning coal is bad, and we have problems with that. But the biggest opposition is coming from people who don't want these long trains, 1.5-mile trains coming through their communities, which is not necessarily a problem of we shouldn't have these coal trains. It's a problem of how do we invest in these grade separations. Please.
I was surprised by the importance of small business and foreign trade that you brought up early in the presentation. Yeah. Considering how important small business is in our state economy and our federal economy, what can we do to remain competitive, and what types of policy would benefit us?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier, when we talk about imports, we have to be really sensitive, right? Because if I got up here and said, imports are great, there's no problem with outsourcing globalization, you just ignore me for the rest of the time, right? That's not true. Jobs are being lost to globalization. The jobs that are being lost to globalization are jobs in industries where we are not currently competitive right now because of wages, because of infrastructure, because of a skilled workforce, frankly. And so we can try all sorts of trade policies like tariffs and other barriers to try and force those jobs to come back here. We're probably not going to be super successful. The way we're going to get those jobs to be created here, and the right kinds of jobs to be created here, the kinds of jobs that are good for American workers, are really, in my mind, two main things. It's education and it's infrastructure. We need to have people who can do the jobs in Washington State. The statistic that drives me crazy is that there are 6,000 job openings in Washington State in IT right now. 6,000 job openings that cannot be filled, 3,600 at Microsoft alone. How many unemployed people are there in this state? It's crazy that we can't fill 6,000 jobs that pay on average $85,000 a year, right? Why can't we fill those jobs? We don't educate enough computer scientists, right? We don't educate enough people in math and science in this country, and there's maybe a number of reasons for that, but I don't care what the reasons are. We have to do better. We have to do better at funding those opportunities in our colleges and universities. We have to do a better job of getting students starting in, at 4th grade and even younger, excited about those opportunities, convincing them that math is very boring. I mean, that's why none of us here are math majors, or maybe you are, congratulations. But excellent, I'm very glad. But we've got to make it exciting, because if we don't, these are real jobs that we're missing out to. Microsoft's number one goal right now is to get more immigrants to come to Washington State with those high-skilled jobs, right? It's called an H-1B visa. And they're trying to get more H-1B visa immigrants to come to Washington State. The only reason they're doing that, they would be more than happy to hire the best and the brightest from Washington State. They can't. Those people aren't here. And so if we're not educating the people of this state and of this country for the jobs that exist here, those companies will eventually move. And at some point, Microsoft will say, why are we spending all this money and time bringing all these people over here to Washington State? Let's just go over there, and we'll do all of our work over there. So the education piece is huge. And then, for the goods and the infrastructure. And infrastructure is not only roads and rail, it's broadband infrastructure. It's our airport infrastructure, particularly, like I said, a growing part of our exports are tourism and professional services. We need to make sure that we've got great air connections to the rest of the world as well. So very simple investments that we can make, not simple is maybe the wrong word, straightforward investments that we can make. That's how we're going to be competitive. That's how we're going to grow our economy. And frankly, the reason why Washington State is so successful in the global economy, it's one very simple reason. We make the goods and services that people want to buy. And the way that you make the goods and services that people want to buy is having really, really smart people here making and selling those goods and services.
We have 3 more questions.
All right.
Then you're off the hook. These are from the audience, the written questions. What U.S. trade policy do you think impacts Washington State trade with China the most?
So, intellectual property protection. That may sound weird and boring, but intellectual property protection, right? So intellectual property is anything that we create and patent and trademark in this country, right? A piece of software, a brand, an idea, whatever that is. Microsoft software is a great example of an intellectual property that we create here in Washington State. And Microsoft likes to say that China would be the #1 market in the world for Microsoft software if everyone in China using Microsoft software was paying for it, which they're not. Microsoft loses about $1 billion a year in illegal pirated sales of Microsoft products to China. That is a huge, huge deal. And we always talk about intellectual property protection in terms of software and movies. You know what the #2 most intellectual property pirated thing in China is after software and movies? It's fashion and apparel, right? It's your REI vest, it's your UGG boots, it's whatever brand of Levi's or whatever it is. There is a Chinese knockoff product with the REI brand right there on it, except maybe it's spelled RIE or something like that. If you're not looking carefully. Intellectual property protection is huge. It's huge for software. It's huge for manufactured goods like Boeing airplanes on down. It's important for fashion and apparel. It is important for agricultural goods. There are Chinese apples right now with a Washington apple sticker on them. This is a true thing. I've seen this. So protecting our intellectual property in China is the most important thing that we can do to grow our economy. That's a hard thing to do. You can't just pass a law. You can't even just tell China, start doing a better job of this, although they have. I met a couple months ago with 3 judges from the Chinese IP tribunal. They have a whole system of judges that are just there to educate intellectual property issues. When China's really going to get serious about intellectual property protection is when they start generating a lot of their own intellectual property and decide, hey, we really need to protect this stuff. But it's a process that the U.S. is very much engaged in right now. There's a woman named Victoria Espinel who is the head of the Office of U.S. Intellectual Property Enforcement, whose job it is to really push on these issues, and she's doing a great job, and we're making some headway there.
Questions here. The next question we have is, how can we increase trade with countries other than China?
And that's a fantastic question because there are a lot of other countries in the world besides China, and a lot of very fast-growing economies. The best way to make sure that we're selling Washington State and U.S. goods and services to other countries is to make sure that we have a level playing field in those countries. We can compete with any country in almost any good and service as long as we're not paying inordinate tariffs on trying to get our goods into that market, that there aren't other types of trade barriers and market barriers in those countries, that they're protecting our intellectual property. There are huge opportunities in many countries. Right now, there is an active process right now to develop a new US-EU new free trade agreements. And right now the EU is in the news because of how bad their economy is doing, but it is still one of the largest economies in the world. And we actually do quite a bit of business with the EU, even as Washington State, less on the goods side, but more on the services side. The number one export market for Microsoft software is the EU outside the United States. So the EU is a huge market opportunity. South America is a huge market opportunity, specifically Brazil. But when you look at Brazil, they have very, very, very high trade barriers there. When you look at India, they have incredibly high trade barriers there. They are barely letting foreign brands into India right now. Starbucks is finally able, they're opening Starbucks stores in India right now in a partnership with Tata, which some of you may know is one of the largest companies in India, but huge barriers to foreign direct investment into India. And so one of the interesting statistics is there have been 30 free trade agreements passed over the last 4 years by countries, between countries. The U.S. has passed 3 of them, which is not a great margin when you think about, there aren't that many countries out there really engaging internationally. We need to do more of that. And free trade agreement's a funny term, right? It sounds like we just sort of, throw the rule book out the window, come, and it's, the Wild West. Let's have a bunch of free trade. It's nothing like that whatsoever. It's a better term is managed trade. We set different rules. We lower some tariffs. We, protect our trade a little bit more. But there are just as many rules, if not more, under free trade agreements. So there are huge opportunities there. And like I said, I would probably highlight India, Brazil, and the EU as the biggest opportunities in the near term.
There is a new stadium in the southern part of Seattle. The question is, what impact would that structure have on trade that comes through Seattle?
These are my 2 favorite topics: coal trains and basketball arenas. This is what I like to talk about all day long. I mentioned that our ports are really important. They're really important, and they're not just important because of the jobs that are created at the ports and the jobs that are created by people who work in and out of the ports, the truckers and the rail and folks like that. There are a number of companies that are in Washington State, mainly because this is a really easy place to get goods in and out of. The Boeing company is here. A lot of the ag folks are here. A lot of the the apparel and retail folks are here because this is a really easy place to get goods in and out of. And if this is not a really easy place to get goods in and out of, they're going to leave. And that is not a good thing. That's not what we want. I don't know how much the basketball arena is going to make a difference, but regardless of whether the basketball arena is there or not, we need to do a much, much better job of investing in freight mobility at the Port of Seattle, and frankly at other ports across the state as well. We've got to make sure that it is easy to get goods in and out of our ports. It's not easy right now to get goods in and out of the Port of Seattle. So we have to find a way to have more overpasses. We have to find a way to invest more in roads and rail, whether or not there's a basketball arena there, and probably, I would say, especially if there's a basketball arena there.
Last question.
All right.
This one has to do, I would say, with education. As you know, obviously, the students in the audience are pursuing, for the most part, an associate's degree, and many have the aspirations to then go on to a baccalaureate degree. This student would like to know, how does one get a job, what background does one need in Washington's import and export business?
So it's interesting because what do you think of when you think of, a job in trade, a job in the import-export business? Well, if you're being really, really literal, you're talking about, oh, I want a job, working for a trucking company. Oh, I want a job at the port. Oh, I want a job, working with a railroad. And there are some really fantastic programs in this state, not to mention a different community college, but there is a different community college called Highline Community College. Some of you may know, and they have a program there. Highline Community College is the center of excellence for international trade, transportation, and logistics for the state of Washington. And that doesn't mean that you have to go to Highline Community College. Their job is to actually coordinate with all the community colleges in the state, including Shoreline, what the curriculum is that you need to get a job in the international trade, transportation, and logistics industry. And so there are classes here that are being taught. There are classes across the state that are being taught specifically in that. And one of the things that the Center of Excellence does a really good job of is they actually go out and they talk to businesses in that industry and say, what are the skills you're looking for? And then they design those curriculums and they share it with the community colleges around the state. They do a fantastic job. And I would recommend you go on the website of the Center of Excellence for International Trade, Transportation, and Logistics and check that out. But that's not necessarily the answer to your question. Because I mentioned earlier, what are the top 4 industries in Washington state in trade? It's aerospace, it's software, it's agriculture, and it's tourism. None of those have to do necessarily with driving a truck or working on a ship or working on a rail. Every industry in Washington state is a trade industry, is a job and import-export. And so depending on what industry it is that you're looking at, you're going to need a different skill. If you want to go into IT, you need your STEM degree, your science, technology, engineering, and math degree. If you're going into aerospace, there are so many amazing jobs. If you figure out how to become a machinist, 50% of Boeing machinists are retiring within the next 5 to 10 years. Those are amazing, amazing jobs. They are such well-paying jobs. You can graduate from high school and get a 6-week training course and make $60,000 a year as a machinist at Boeing right now. Not that you should graduate from high school and go into workforce. You should definitely get your college degree. But amazing, amazing opportunities. And you are making airplanes as a Boeing machinist, 90% of which are being sold to international customers. And so I think that's a really, really important distinction that you all need to make is there are jobs in transportation and logistics, which are great jobs, and there are really direct ways to study and get those jobs. But there are also jobs in trade-related industries, aerospace and IT and all of these others that I've mentioned before. Those are also great jobs. There are a ton of those jobs. If you want to get a job in Washington State, become a machinist or get a science and engineering degree or a computer science degree, I guarantee you will get a job. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, okay, it is working. Well, I just have a question in response to something you said. It's maybe not on the topic, but I just noticed something you said about India. I just I just thought that there were tons of companies, like U.S. companies, working in India. I just wanted you to clarify what you said about India having lots of barriers, and it's, just in response to something you said.
Sure. So the most direct example recently is Walmart has wanted to open a lot of stores in India, right? The Indian retail sector is really, really, really protected. You cannot have a foreign brand just sort of setting up retail stores in India right now. And there's been very controversial, and they changed the policy to say, yes, you can, and then they changed it back to say, no, you can't. No, we were wrong about that, and they've gone back and forth. There are absolutely American companies selling products in India. I didn't mean to say that we can't sell our products there. I was referring specifically to setting up shop there, setting up retail branches and retail stores and operations in India. But there are absolutely barriers as well. There are still high tariffs on Washington State products in India. So yes, we're selling them there, but we're selling them at a disadvantage. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Yes.
Can you, one more last question I'd like to ask, and this kind of brings it back to the campaigns and why we don't talk about trade, but in the last 50, 60 years, we've seen in trade policy a shift from the importance of what we call tariff issues, those are like taxes on imports or exports, to non-tariff issues, and those tend to be arcane stuff, TCK of wheat, Asian longhorn beetles, and stuff coming from China. We can go on and on, but they tend to be more arcane, hard to measure kind of barriers. Yeah. Do you think the fact that, I'm wondering, the fact that trade policy dispute resolution has shifted from something that was pretty measurable and visible, a tariff, to these non-tariff barriers, it's harder for candidates to talk about that stuff on the campaign trail?
I think that's absolutely true. I think at the end of the day, a lot has happened in media coverage of campaigns, the way media and technology has changed, that I don't think that we have the same kinds of discussions in presidential campaigns as we used to. I don't think we have the same depth of discourse and debate in presidential campaigns. So probably, if you ask me the number one reason why, is because that doesn't really fit well into 140 characters, right? And it's not a good tweet, and so we don't talk about it. Good. All right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed tonight's program. Again, we welcome your feedback. Please take a moment to complete the survey in your program and hand it to the person at the door as you exit. We hope you will attend other events in this series. The next one is happening next Wednesday, October 31st at 7 p.m. in this room. Bill Center, a senior advisor at the Humphrey Fellows Program. He's a retired Rear Admiral for the U.S. Navy, and another familiar face to some of you, will join us to discuss defense policies and U.S. presidential elections. If you would like to receive notification of future events or support the work of the Global Affairs Center, indicate this as well on the feedback sheet or send an email to the address in your program. If you would like to make a financial donation to the work of the Global Affairs Center, which organized this event tonight, you can do so as you leave the room or online at the address in the program. Thank you again for joining us, and have a safe trip home. Good night.